A company that had never designed a land-based fighter in its history was about to build one of the finest fighters of the Second World War. Kawanishi built floatplanes, seaplanes, aircraft that took off from water, not runways. The Japanese Navy's own engineers doubted the company had any business building a fighter meant to fly from land at all. They were wrong, and the reason they were wrong is the same reason this story ends in wreckage. The philosophy was simple. Take everything learned from the sea and force it onto solid ground. The wing shape that let it slice through ocean spray would soon carry cannons into the skies over Japan. But that same shape, bent and reshaped for a machine that had never touched water, would come back to break the very pilots flying it. How does a seaplane company end up building the aircraft that finally gave Japan's exhausted pilots an even fight against the Hellcat and the Corsair? The answer starts with one engineer. His name was Shizuo Kikuhara. This is the story of the Kawanishi N1K, born of the sea, exiled to land, and arriving just in time to be too late. By 1940, Shizuo Kikuhara was already one of Japan's most respected aircraft engineers, though almost nobody outside the Navy knew his name. He had trained years earlier under Britain's Short Brothers, one of the world's pioneering seaplane manufacturers, and brought that education home to Kawanishi, where he helped design the H-8K, the four-engine flying boat the Japanese Navy considered its finest long-range patrol aircraft. Kikuhara understood water. He understood floats, hulls, spray patterns, and the strange aerodynamics of an airplane that had to behave like a boat before it could behave like a bird. What he did not have, in September 1940, was any experience building a fighter meant to take off from a runway. That month, the Imperial Japanese Navy handed Kawanishi a specification that sounded almost impossible. A floatplane fighter capable of at least 310 knots at 16,400 feet, with enough range to cruise for 6 hours. It needed to be armed well enough to fight land-based aircraft on equal terms, from a plane sitting on a pair of pontoons. The idea was straightforward on paper. As Japan's forces pushed across the Pacific, they would need air cover over beachheads and remote islands where no airstrip yet existed. A fighter that needed no runway could go wherever the fleet went. Inside the Navy itself, some engineers were skeptical that Kawanishi was the right company for the job. The firm had built its reputation entirely on seaplanes and flying boats. Land-based fighter design was a different discipline, different structural loads, different landing gear, different everything. Kikuhara's team, which included engineers Toshihara Baba, Hiroyuki Inoue, and Elizaburo Adachi, pressed ahead anyway. The resulting design, the N1K1 Kyofu, Mighty Wind, carried its wing mounted at the middle of the fuselage. This was not an aesthetic choice, it was a mechanical necessity. A floatplane needs clearance between its propeller and the water, and between its wings and the spray thrown up at takeoff speed. Mounting the wing high on the body solved that problem instantly. It was a smart, water-tested engineering decision built for an aircraft that would never touch a runway. Then, in December 1941, months before the Kyofu had even completed its first test flight, Kikuhara's team began quietly designing something the Navy hadn't asked for yet, a land-based version. No floats, retractable landing gear in their place. It started by most accounts as a private venture. Engineers who could see further than their orders, converting a seaplane fighter into something that might finally give Japan's land forces a competitive edge against the growing weight of American air power. The Kyofu itself flew for the first time on May 6, 1942, powered by a Keisei-13 radial engine. It handled well enough in the air, but it was already, in a sense, obsolete before it left the water. A floatplane fighter designed for a war that was rapidly moving past the need for one. The land-based conversion, born quietly in a design office before anyone had officially approved it, was the future. And it carried, hidden inside its very shape, the same wing position that had once solved a seaplane's problems, now waiting to create a new one entirely. To understand why Kawanishi's land-based gamble mattered, you have to understand what it was racing against. Not one rival, but two, on two different fronts. The first rival wasn't a machine at all. It was time itself, and Nakajima Aircraft Company was the one exploiting it. While Kikuhara's team was still refining the Kyofu, the Navy needed something, anything, to fill the floatplane fighter role immediately. Nakajima's answer was the A6M2N, a crude but fast solution. Take the already proven Mitsubishi Zero, bolt a single central float and two stabilizing floats underneath it, and call it done. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't purpose-built, but it was ready first, and it filled the gap while Kawanishi's more ambitious design was still on the drawing board. For a company betting its reputation on a purpose-built floatplane fighter, watching a converted Zero beat you into service was not a comfortable position. But the rival that would matter for the rest of this story, the one this aircraft would spend the next 3 years measured against in the skies over the Pacific, wore a different insignia entirely. It flew off the decks of American carriers, and its name was the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. By the time Kawanishi's land-based fighter would see combat, the Hellcat would already be the backbone of American naval air power, rugged, simple to produce in overwhelming numbers, and flown by pilots trained in a system that could replace losses faster than Japan could dream of matching. The Hellcat wasn't the fastest fighter in the Pacific, and it wasn't the most maneuverable. It didn't need to be. It needed to be good enough, built by the thousands, and flown by men who had the fuel and the training hours Japan's pilots increasingly did not. That was the standard. That was the wall Kawanishi's engineers didn't yet know they were building toward. The official specification that had started all of this remained blunt and unforgiving at least 310 knots, roughly 357 miles per hour, at 16,400 feet, with enough fuel for 6 full hours in the air. Armament had to include either a pair of 20mm cannon and two 7.7mm machine guns, or an equivalent mix using heavier 13.2mm guns. It needed to carry at least two 66-pound bombs. For comparison, the A6M20, Japan's frontline fighter and already in combat over China, at the time the specification was issued, could not meet those numbers as a floatplane at all. Kawanishi wasn't being asked to match an existing aircraft. They were being asked to beat one that hadn't been converted yet. On numbers nobody had proven a floatplane fighter could hit. The Kyofu prototype's first flight on May 6, 1942, was itself a trial by fire in more ways than one. The aircraft had been designed with contra-rotating propellers, two propellers spinning in opposite directions on the same shaft, intended to cancel out the torque of its powerful Keisei-14 engine and keep the aircraft stable at low speed on the water. It was an elegant solution to a real problem. It also did not work reliably. Persistent gearbox failures forced Kawanishi to abandon the contra-rotating setup for production aircraft, switching to a conventional three-bladed propeller instead. A compromise, but one that let the program move forward. 97 Kyofu floatplanes were eventually built, and the type would go on to serve in limited numbers over Borneo and the waters around Balikpapan. That was the seaplane's own quiet ending. Solid, serviceable, ultimately outpaced by a war that no longer needed what it was built to do. But the land-based conversion, already taking shape in Kikuhara's design office before the Kyofu had even proven itself, was where the real trial waited. Stripped of its floats, fitted with retractable landing gear and a four-bladed propeller driven by a new 1,820 horsepower Homare engine, armed now with two additional 20mm cannon mounted in gondolas beneath the wings, the aircraft was a different animal entirely, faster, harder hitting, and finally capable of operating from the same airstrips as its American rivals. The land-based prototype took to the air for the first time on December 27, 1942. The Navy, watching a seaplane company deliver an aircraft that was pumping, on paper, faster than the Zero and carrying more range than Japan's dedicated interceptor, the Raiden, did something it rarely did for outsiders. It approved production immediately, designating the new fighter the N1K2-J. They gave it a name that sounded like a warning and a promise in the same breath: Shiden, Violet Lightning. Kawanishi had done what its own Navy doubted it could do. A company that had spent 20 years building airplanes to land on water had built a fighter to fight from land, one that, on paper, could finally stand toe-to-toe with whatever the United States sent against it. The trial was won. The war was not. Violet Lightning did not get a quiet introduction. The Shiden was rushed toward squadrons carrying all the promise of its specification, and immediately, all the growing pains of an aircraft built faster than it could be properly tested. The first operational unit to receive the new fighter was the 201st Kokutai, deployed to Cebu in the Philippines. On paper, This was exactly the assignment the Shiden had been built for. A land-based fighter finally capable of matching American aircraft on equal terms, defending Japanese-held territory in the heart of the Pacific theater. In practice, the deployment revealed almost immediately how much unfinished business the aircraft still carried. American fighters caught a number of the new Shidens on the ground at Cebu and destroyed them before they ever left the runway. This was not simply bad luck. It was a symptom of a machine still working through the growing pains of its rushed development. An aircraft that needed more time and testing than the war was willing to give it. The engine at the heart of the Shiden, a new 1,820 horsepower Homare radial, had been pushed into production without the extended development period an engine of that complexity would normally require. Reliability problems surfaced early and often. Pilots reported engines that ran rough, lost power unpredictably, and demanded far more maintenance than the ground crews on a forward airstrip in the Philippines could reasonably provide. And then there was the landing gear, a problem written into the aircraft's DNA from the very moment Kikuhara's team began the land conversion. The Shiden had inherited its wing position directly from its seaplane ancestor, the Kyofu, mounted at the middle of the fuselage rather than low on the body. That mid-wing placement had made perfect sense for a floatplane, where it kept the wings clear of ocean spray and the propellers safely above the waterline. On a land-based fighter, it created an entirely different problem. To give the propeller enough clearance from the runway with a wing mounted that high, the landing gear legs had to be long enough that they flexed under load, long enough that they were prone to failure on anything but a smooth landing. Pilots at Cebu found the gear temperamental in a way that cost them aircraft even without a single American fighter overhead. None of this made the Shiden a bad airplane. Contemporary pilots who flew it and Allied intelligence officers who examined captured examples consistently praised its speed and maneuverability compared to Japan's earlier fighters. It was, in the air, everything the specification had promised. But an airplane that struggles on the ground before it even engages the enemy is an airplane still being paid for in blood while its designers work out the flaws. And Kawanishi's engineers knew exactly where those flaws were coming from, because they had built them in themselves, inherited from an aircraft meant to float rather than roll. The response came almost immediately, and it says something about how seriously Kawanishi treated the problem. A complete redesign of the aircraft began just 4 days after the N1K2-J's first test flight in December 1942, before the fighter had even reached squadron service, let alone before the failures at Cebu confirmed what the engineers already suspected. The goal was direct: fix what the seaplane heritage had broken. The redesign moved the wing from its mid-fuselage position down to a conventional low-wing configuration, the standard layout for virtually every successful land-based fighter of the war. With the wing lowered, the landing gear could finally be shortened to a normal sturdy length instead of the long spindly legs the mid-wing design had demanded. The fuselage was reshaped around this change, lengthened slightly, with a redesigned tail to match the new proportions. Engineers also used the redesign as an opportunity to simplify the entire production process. More than a third of the parts from the original Shiden could still be used in the new version, even as the airframe shed roughly 550 pounds of weight, making it lighter, faster, and considerably easier to build in wartime conditions. It was, in effect, Kawanishi correcting its own inheritance, taking the very design choice that had once been the smart, water-tested solution to a seaplane's problems and finally cutting it away now that the aircraft no longer needed it. The new variant would carry a new name to match its new shape, the N1K2-J Shiden Kai, Violet Lightning Improved. But the improved version was not yet in the fight. For now, in the skies over the Philippines and the waters of the Pacific, the original Shiden remained exactly what it was, a fighter with real teeth, hobbled by a body it had never quite finished becoming. Somewhere in a Kawanishi design office, the fix was already taking shape on drafting tables. Whether it would arrive in time was a question the war itself was about to start answering. The N1K2-J Shiden Kai made its first flight on January 1, 1944, and it arrived carrying something no other fighter aircraft in the entire war would ever have. Buried in the wings was a piece of mechanical ingenuity that still surprises engineers who study it today: an automatic combat flap system. The landing flaps on the Shiden Kai did double duty. During a hard turn, a tube containing a simple mercury switch, linked to the aircraft's pitot static air system, could sense the combination of G-force and airspeed. The moment a pilot pulled the stick hard into a turn, when the load crossed a certain threshold, the flaps would deploy automatically, up to 30 degrees, adding lift precisely when the wing needed it most, tightening the turn radius without the pilot doing a single thing beyond flying the fight in front of him. The instant the turn eased off, the flaps retracted on their own. No other production fighter of the Second World War used anything like it. American pilots who tangled with the Shiden Kai and lived to file a report came home describing a Japanese fighter that turned tighter than it had any right to, with no idea that a length of glass tubing and a bead of mercury was doing the work their own hands would have had to do. It was not just agile, it was armed like a heavyweight. 4 20mm Type 99 cannons sat in the wings, giving the Shiden Kai enough firepower to shred an Allied fighter in a single burst or put real damage into a heavy bomber. Powered by the same Homare engine, now uprated and running more reliably than its predecessor, the Shiden Kai could reach 369 miles per hour at just over 18,000 feet. For the first time, a Japanese Navy fighter existed that could take on the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the Vought F-4U Corsair on something closer to equal terms, rather than relying purely on pilot skill to offset a machine that had fallen behind. The aircraft's reputation grew quickly enough that it changed how the Navy chose to use it. Rather than distributing the limited number of Shiden Kai fighters broadly across ordinary squadrons, the Navy funneled them into a single, deliberately elite formation. That unit was the 343rd Kokutai, constituted on December 25, 1944, under the command of Captain Minoru Genda, the same officer who had helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier. Genda built the 343rd differently from almost any other Japanese air unit of the war. Instead of filling its cockpits with fresh graduates rushed through wartime training, he handpicked surviving veteran aces from across the crumbling Japanese Navy, pilots who had fought since the opening campaigns in China, men who had survived years of attrition that had killed most of their contemporaries. Command of the unit's 3 fighter squadrons went to some of the most experienced pilots still flying for Japan: Lieutenant Naoshi Kano, leading the 301st, Lieutenant Yoshishige Hayashi leading the 407th, and Lieutenant Takashi Oshibuchi leading the 701st. Genda gave the unit its own reconnaissance arm as well, flying fast, C-6N Seiyan aircraft to scout for incoming American raids before they ever reached Japanese airspace, an early warning advantage few Japanese units of the period possessed. Pilots and crews began calling it Genda's Blade. It was, by the final year of the war, arguably the single most dangerous concentration of fighter pilots and fighter aircraft. Japan had left a field, built specifically around a machine whose seaplane origins had once nearly doomed it in the skies over the Philippines, now carrying some of the last great aces of the Imperial Navy into battle over the Japanese home islands themselves. The early results justified Genda's gamble. In February 1945, Ensign Kaneyoshi Muto, flying a Shiden Kai, as part of a mixed 10-plane Japanese formation, ran into 7 American Hellcats from Squadron VF-82 over Japan. By the time the engagement ended, the Japanese formation had shot down 4 Hellcats without losing a single aircraft of their own. Japanese propaganda would later inflate the story into a solo legend: 1 man against 12 enemy fighters, but the true account, 10 aircraft against 7, 4 kills for 0 losses, needed no exaggeration to be remarkable. It was proof, in the air over Japan itself, that the aircraft Kawanishi had built from a floatplane's bones could finally stand and fight the best America had. But an elite unit flying a rare, complex, mechanically ambitious fighter was never going to win a war of numbers on its own. Somewhere behind the cockpits and the mercury switches and the 4 cannon in each wing, the same pressures that had haunted this aircraft from its first flight, an engine rushed into service, a production line never quite large enough, were still waiting. Genda's Blade was about to be tested by the largest carrier strike force the U.S. Navy could throw at the Japanese home islands. And the flaw this aircraft had carried since its earliest design decisions was about to matter more than it ever had before. The design choice that had already cost Kawanishi aircraft on the ground at Cebu wasn't the only inheritance from the Shiden's rushed birth. A deeper problem sat at the very heart of the aircraft, one that no amount of redesigned wing position could touch: the engine. The Homare Radial had been pushed into production without the years of refinement an engine of its complexity would normally demand, and even in its uprated form powering the Shiden Kai, it never fully shed that history. At low and medium altitudes, where most of the fighter's celebrated dogfights took place, the Homare performed well enough to let the aircraft's speed and maneuverability shine. But above roughly 21,000 feet, the engine's performance fell away sharply. Power dropped, reliability worsened, and the responsiveness that made the Shiden Kai such a dangerous turning fighter lower down began to disappear exactly when a pilot needed it most. 21,000 feet was not a random number. It was almost precisely the altitude at which American B-29 superfortresses conducted their bombing runs over Japan. The very aircraft this fighter had been rushed into elite squadrons to stop were operating in the one altitude band where the Shiden Kai's engine was at its worst. A fighter built to turn tighter than anything else in the sky was, against the bombers burning Japanese cities, forced to fight at a disadvantage baked into its own power plant. This was not a flaw anyone could fix with a mercury switch or a redesigned undercarriage. It was a limitation of Japan's wartime industrial base itself, an engine manufacturer racing to deliver horsepower figures the airframe needed, without the luxury of years of bench testing that a peacetime program would have demanded. Kikuhara's team had built one of the most agile fighters of the war around an engine that could not fully deliver on its promise at the exact altitude where the stakes were highest. And the industrial pressure did not stop there. As American strategic bombing intensified through 1944 and into 1945, B-29 raids increasingly targeted the very factories building the aircraft meant to stop them. Kawanishi's production lines, already straining to manufacture a complex fighter with a temperamental engine, absorbed direct damage from the raids its own product was supposed to prevent. The math became brutally circular. The better the Shiden Kai might have been at stopping B-29s at lower altitudes, the more those same B-29s targeted the factories keeping it in the fight, and the fewer Shiden Kai reached squadrons to do the stopping. The number tells the story on its own. Across the entire war, only 415 N1K2-J Shiden Kai fighters were ever built. Compare that to the thousands of Hellcats and Corsairs rolling off American assembly lines, built by an industrial base that had never once seen an enemy bomber over its own factories. Japan had, by 1944, finally designed a fighter capable of meeting the best American carrier aircraft on close to equal terms in the air. It simply could not build enough of them, fast enough, to matter at the scale the war now demanded. There was a second front where the same trap kept tightening. The Shiden Kai's rarity meant it never fully replaced Japan's aging fleet of Zeros and older interceptors. It supplemented a force that was, on the whole, still falling further behind. American industrial capacity meant that for every skilled Japanese veteran lost in a dogfight, however evenly matched, there were fresh American pilots and fresh American aircraft arriving in numbers Japan's shrinking training pipeline could no longer approach. Even a fighter with genuinely superior maneuverability at low altitude, flown by some of the last great aces the Imperial Navy had left, was fighting a war of attrition it had no mathematical way to win. Skill and clever engineering could still win individual engagements. They could not, by themselves, replace an aircraft industry running at a fraction of its rival's capacity under direct bombardment, building an engine still fighting its own reliability problems years after it should have matured. By the final months of the war, the 343rd Kokutai, Genda's blade, flying the most capable fighter Japan had ever produced against the Americans, represented something close to the ceiling of what Japanese engineering could still achieve. It also represented, in its rarity and its narrow operational window, exactly how far that ceiling now sat below what the war actually required. The aircraft that had once been doubted as impossible for a seaplane company to build had become, by early 1945, one of the finest fighters flying in the Pacific. It had arrived with a flaw baked into its own engine, a production line under direct attack, and barely 400 airframes to carry the weight of everything riding on it. Everything Kawanishi had built toward, the redesigned wing, the mercury switch flaps, the hand-picked pilots of Genda's blade, was about to be tested in a single, decisive clash over one of Japan's most important naval bases. The outcome would prove, in the space of a single morning, exactly how much the Shiden Kai could do and exactly how much it could no longer change. Dawn over the Bungo Strait, March 19, 1945, came in gray and cold, and it did not stay quiet for long. 15 minutes before 6 in the morning, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, fast C-6N Scion planes, flying ahead of the 343rd Kokutai's main force, spotted unusual activity on the decks of American carriers far out to sea. Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 was launching aircraft, and launching them in force. This was no probing raid. It was one of the largest carrier strikes the U.S. Navy had yet thrown at the Japanese home islands, aimed squarely at the naval base at Kure and the airfields defending it, including Matsuyama, where the 343rd Kokutai made its home. Minoru Genda did not wait to confirm the scale of the threat before committing his unit. Within the hour, he sent 4 more Scion reconnaissance aircraft aloft, escorted by 7 Shiden fighters, to get eyes on exactly what was coming. Then he committed the bulk of Genda's blade to the sky. 16 Shiden Kai from the 701st Hikotai, under Captain Oshibuchi, 17 more from the 407th, under Captain Hayashi, 21 from the 301st, under Captain Kano, 72 aircraft in total, climbing to meet a force that vastly outnumbered them, flown by pilots who were, in many cases, the last surviving combat veterans the Imperial Navy had left. The 407th was recalled partway through the intercept, ordered back to base as a second wave of American aircraft approached from a different direction. The 701st and 301st pressed on toward the enemy. What happened next has been recorded from both sides of the fight, and the two accounts do not fully agree, which is itself part of the story. 20 Grumman F-6F Hellcats from Squadron VBF-17, the Jolly Rogers, ran directly into roughly 40 fighters from the 343rd Kokutai. What followed was a 25-minute battle fought at close range over the water, cannon fire and machine guns, aircraft twisting through tight turns that, for the Japanese pilots, were being tightened automatically by the same Mercury switch flap system built into their wings years earlier. By the time the engagement broke apart, 6 American pilots and 4 Japanese pilots had gone down. Personal accounts from American aviators who survived encounters with the 343rd that day describe something they hadn't expected from Japanese pilots by this stage of the war. Men who fought with discipline, who didn't panic and didn't throw their aircraft away in suicidal attacks, who flew, in the words of pilots who faced them, like professionals. The 343rd, Kokutai's own claims for the day were far larger than that single engagement. Pilots reported 52 American aircraft destroyed and 16 more probably destroyed, against 16 Japanese losses. It is worth being direct about what that number actually represents. It was a wartime claim, made in the chaos of a multi-hour engagement across a wide stretch of sky and sea, by pilots reporting what they believed they had seen. American records from the day, cross-referenced after the war, account for a total of 14 U.S. aircraft lost across all the fighting around Kure that day, against 25 Japanese aircraft. A very different ratio than the 343rd's own claim, though still a real and costly fight for the Americans. Both figures are part of the historical record. Neither should be mistaken for the other. What is not in dispute is the shape of the fight itself and what it proved. This was not a unit of desperate, outmatched pilots being fed into a losing war. This was Japan's most capable fighter, flown by some of its most experienced remaining aviators, meeting American carrier aircraft on genuinely even terms for the first time in nearly 2 years of steadily worsening odds. Elsewhere that same morning, the American strike force paid its own price. 2 U.S. carriers were hit hard. One, the USS Franklin, struck by bombs that tore through her decks and killed 724 of her crew, one of the costliest single-day losses any American carrier suffered in the entire war. Kure itself, the primary target, came through largely intact. Not a single major Japanese warship in the harbor was sunk that day. For the 343rd Kokutai, March 19th stood as the high-water mark of everything Kawanishi's engineers and Minoru Genda's hand-picked pilots had built toward. 72 aircraft born from a seaplane's redesigned bones had gone up against the finest carrier air power the United States could send across the Pacific and come back having drawn blood on close to equal terms. It would not happen again at that scale. The unit that flew out from Matsuyama that morning was, in a very real sense, as strong as Japan's air defense would ever be for the remainder of the war. The aircraft could still turn tighter than anything the Americans put in the sky below 20,000 feet. The pilots flying it were still among the best Japan had left. But the industrial current pulling against this fighter since the day its engine left the factory floor had not stopped moving, and the calendar itself was working against everything the 343rd Kokutai had just proven it could do. Kure had shown what Genda's blade was capable of at its absolute peak. What came next would show what happened when a nation ran out of factories, fuel, and time to keep that peak from becoming the beginning of the end. By the spring of 1945, the war that had once given the Shiden Kai its purpose was already consuming the company that built it. In March 1945, Kawanishi Aircraft Company quietly changed its name to Jinmu Akitsusha, a deliberate attempt to hide the firm's identity and its factories from American intelligence, which had by then identified Kawanishi as a priority target for the strategic bombing campaign grinding through Japan's aircraft industry. The disguise didn't last. Within 5 months, the name was dropped again, its purpose already overtaken by events. By then, American B-29 raids had already battered Kawanishi's production facilities directly. The same bombers the Shiden Kai had been rushed into elite service to stop now systematically destroying the factories that built it. Where the company had once produced hundreds of Shiden and Shiden Kai fighters a year, output collapsed under the weight of bombed-out tooling, disrupted supply chains, and a workforce increasingly diverted to bomb damage repair instead of aircraft assembly. 3 outcomes, in 3 different directions, mark where this story actually ends. Shizuo Kikuhara, the engineer who had trained under Britain's Short brothers and spent a career designing aircraft meant to touch water before he ever touched a runway, survived the war. He had built, by any honest engineering measure, one of the finest fighters Imperial Japan ever fielded. A machine that could turn inside a Hellcat, hit as hard as anything in the Pacific theater below 20,000 feet, and do it with technology no other country's engineers had thought to build into a wartime fighter. He had also built it inside an industrial system that could never give him the engine reliability, the production capacity, or the time his design deserved. Kikuhara's name would remain known chiefly to aviation historians and enthusiasts rather than the wider public, a footnote to a fighter that, in the popular imagination, is still overshadowed by the more famous Zero it was built to surpass. A representative pilot's story closes differently. Ensign Kaneyoshi Muto, whose 4-kill, 0-loss engagement in February 1945 had already become one of the Shiden Kai's defining moments, continued flying combat missions with the aircraft through the final chaotic months of the war. One of a shrinking pool of veteran pilots the Imperial Navy could no longer replace at anything like the rate it was losing them. He represented exactly what Genda had built the 343rd Kokutai to preserve, skill and experience concentrated into a machine finally capable of using it. But skill concentrated into 400 airframes could not, on its own, replace an air force that had spent 3 years losing its best pilots faster than any training pipeline could rebuild them. And the company itself faced the most complete reckoning of all. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, Kawanishi's factories lay in ruins, its workforce scattered, its once proud position as one of Japan's premier aircraft manufacturers reduced to rubble alongside nearly every other name in the country's aviation industry. A total of 415 N1K2-J Shiden Kai fighters had been built across the entire production run, a number that, set against the scale of the air, war raging over Japan by 1945, could never have been enough, no matter how capable each individual aircraft was. The Shiden Kai's story, in the end, was never a story about whether the engineering worked. It worked. Pilots who flew it and pilots who fought against it agreed on that much. It was a story about whether engineering excellence, arriving from a company nobody expected to produce it, could outrun an industrial collapse already underway before the aircraft ever left the drafting table. By August 1945, the answer had already been written in bombed factories, in an engine that never fully matured, and in 415 airframes standing against thousands. What Kawanishi built did not save Japan's air war, but it did not disappear either. Not the company, and not the idea that a seaplane maker, doubted by its own navy, could still hand its pilots one of the best fighters of the war. What happened to that legacy, and to the company itself, would take another chapter entirely to tell. Kawanishi, aircraft company in the form that built the Shiden and the Shiden Kai, did not survive the war as a name, but the company itself did not simply vanish either. It went through a series of transformations that mirror almost exactly the chaos and reinvention playing out across Japan's entire aviation industry in the years immediately after surrender. In 1946, production resumed at the remains of the old Nishinomiya factory, not of fighters, but of a civilian motorcycle called the Pointer, built in a country now forbidden by the Allied occupation from manufacturing military aircraft at all. A year later, in 1947, the company renamed itself Meiwa Kogyo, deliberately putting distance between its new civilian identity and its wartime record. By November 1949, that entity split three ways, and one of the resulting companies took a name that would carry Kawanishi's engineering lineage forward: Shin Meiwa Industries. Shin Meiwa's ambitions pointed straight back toward the sky and straight back toward the water. The company began by manufacturing drop tanks for American warplanes stationed in Japan during the post-war years, a modest, almost ironic role for a firm that had once built fighters meant to shoot those aircraft's predecessors down. But when Japan's 1950 aviation law finally permitted the country to design its own aircraft again, Shin Meiwa moved quickly. Engineers purchased a Grumman HU-16 Albatross amphibian and took it apart piece by piece to study American post-war seaplane design, channeling the same expertise in floats and hulls that had once produced the Kyofu into an entirely new generation of aircraft. By 1962, the company had completed the UFXS, a technology testbed that would lead directly to some of the most capable flying boats built anywhere in the world. The company renamed itself once more in 1992, becoming Shin Meiwa Industries, the name it still carries today. Headquartered in Takarazuka, in the same Hyogo prefecture where Kawanishi first built aircraft in the 1920s, Shin Meiwa remains best known internationally for its amphibious aircraft, including the US-2 search and rescue flying boat, still in active service with Japan's self-defense forces. The company has also become part of the international supply chain for Boeing, manufacturing components for the same American aerospace industry whose wartime factories once vastly outproduced Kawanishi's own. There is a quiet symmetry in that. The firm that built one of Japan's finest wartime fighters, undone in part by an industrial base it could never match, now builds parts for the very industrial power that had once buried it in bombers and Hellcats. The men who commanded and flew the Shiden Kai took equally divergent paths after the surrender. Minoru Genda, the architect of Pearl Harbor who had personally handpicked the pilots of the 343rd Kokutai, went on to become a general in the newly formed Japan Air Self-Defense Force and later a member of the Japanese Diet, Japan's national parliament. The man who had built one of the war's most elite fighter units out of Japan's last veteran. Aces spent his post-war decades helping shape the very institutions meant to ensure Japan would never again need a unit like Genda's blade. Physical traces of the aircraft itself are scattered today across 3 continents. A Shiden Kai sits in the Smithsonian's collection at the Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center outside Washington, D.C., alongside other surviving examples of Japanese wartime aviation. Another rests in the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, displayed as one of the fighter-bomber variants that once carried bombs beneath its wings. A third is held by the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. Captured aircraft, brought home after Japan's surrender, that once represented exactly the kind of threat American carrier pilots respected most in the final year of the war. And in April of 2026, the story surfaced again in the most literal sense possible. Off the coast of Kagoshima Prefecture, near the city of Akune, recovery teams pulled a Kawanishi N1K2-J Shiden Kai up from the seabed roughly 3 meters down after more than 81 years underwater. Watched by a gathered crowd of historians, volunteers, and local residents, the wreck emerged from the water still remarkably intact, wings and structural features clearly identifiable, a physical fragment of Genda's blade returning to the surface. 8 decades after the war that built it and buried it, both came to an end. It is a fitting kind of resurfacing for an aircraft whose entire history has quietly slipped beneath the surface of how most people remember the Pacific War. Ask an American audience to name a Japanese fighter from the Second World War, and the answer will almost always be the same: the Zero. Few outside dedicated aviation historians know the name Shiden, let alone Shiden Kai, let alone the seaplane company that built it, or the engineer who trained under a British seaplane firm before designing one of the best land-based fighters Japan ever produced. Part of that is simple wartime timing. The Shiden Kai arrived too late, in too few numbers, to leave the kind of mark on Allied memory that the Zero left in the war's opening years. Part of it is a broader pattern in how Western audiences have told the story of the air war in the Pacific. A story built overwhelmingly around American aircraft and the handful of Japanese types that faced them earliest, with less attention paid to the aircraft that arrived in the war's final, chaotic year, however capable they turned out to be. The historical verdict, when the aircraft finally gets one, tends to agree on the essentials. The engineering was sound. The automatic combat flaps were, by any measure, ahead of their time. The airframe that emerged from Kikuhara's redesign was a genuinely dangerous fighter in skilled hands. What failed was never the design on the drafting table. What failed was the country trying to build it fast enough. In an industrial base already collapsing under the weight of the war, the aircraft had arrived too late to change. Every aircraft in this story carried a philosophy inside its airframe, whether its engineers meant to put it there or not. The Kawanishi N1K began as a philosophy of the sea. Every choice that shaped its earliest form, the wing mounted high on the fuselage, the aerodynamics tuned for clearance above water rather than a runway, came from decades spent building floatplanes and flying boats, from an engineer who had learned his trade watching Britain's Short brothers solve problems that had nothing to do with dogfights or altitude ceilings. It was a philosophy built for takeoff from open water, for a war that needed air cover wherever the fleet could reach, floats and all. Then the philosophy had to change, mid-flight, in the middle of a war that would not wait for a company to finish rethinking itself. Kikuhara's team took an aircraft born to float and forced it to fight from land. And for a while, the seaplane's own bones worked against it, in landing gear that broke and pilots lost before they ever saw an American fighter. The redesign that followed wasn't a rejection of where the aircraft came from. It was an admission that the sea's lessons had limits, and that survival meant cutting away even a design choice as sound as the one that had started it all. What came out the other side was something genuinely new. A fighter with a mercury switch instead of a pilot's constant attention, wings that tightened their own turn without being told to, cannon enough to challenge anything America put in the sky below 20,000 feet. It was, in its own way, a third philosophy layered over the first two, not the sea's caution, not land's brute conventional wisdom, but adaptation itself. Engineering that kept correcting its own mistakes until it produced something no other air force in the war had thought to build. And still, none of it could outfly the industrial math working against it in the background the entire time. An engine matured on a factory floor, still catching up to its own ambition. A production line increasingly buried under the same bombs its fighters were built to intercept. 415 airframes, carrying pilots as good as Japan had left, standing against thousands of Hellcats and Corsairs, rolling off assembly lines an ocean away that no enemy bomber had ever touched. The F-6F Hellcat never needed a mercury switch or an automatic flap. It needed to be good enough, built in overwhelming numbers, and flown by pilots whose training pipeline never ran dry. That was its philosophy, and by 1945, it was winning. Not because it was the better airplane in every dogfight, but because it never had to be. It simply had to exist in numbers the Shiden Kai's philosophy of precision could never match. A company that had never built a land-based fighter went on to build one of the finest fighters of the war. That much was true from the very first chapter of the story, and it remained true to the last. What was also true, and what the popular memory of this war has mostly forgotten, is that being the finest was never going to be enough on its own. The Shiden Kai was a masterpiece of adaptation. The Hellcat was a masterpiece of scale, and scale was what the war had left room for.